Okay, we are recording. All right, well, let's jump in. Good morning, everyone. So happy to have you joining us today to talk about communication measurement. Just to reiterate one more time, we are recording the webinar today so that you can have a recording of this for yourselves, and that anyone that is not able to attend is able to watch it at a later time. So I want to just start with a couple of quick introductions so you know who you're talking with today, and then we're going to jump into our topic. So my name is Ayme Zemke. I'm the Chief Client Officer here at Beehive Strategic Communication, and I am thrilled to be with you today to talk about measurement. And I've got with me my coworker, Abigail.
Hi, everybody. I'm Abigail Greenheck. I am a Group Executive Vice President at Beehive, working on a client portfolio, including a lot of healthcare organizations, and just really look forward to today's discussion.
Awesome. Well, today we're going to want to talk to you about how strong measurement practices build influence and help communication teams really demonstrate value, secure executive buy-in, and really drive business strategy and results. Specifically, we're going to be talking about questions that you should be asking as you're looking to develop your organization's measurement approach. We're going to talk through what we see as kind of the three essential phases of measurement. So we're going to talk about output, impact, and optimization. And most importantly, and really the reason we're here, is to answer your questions. And so that is where we're going to try to spend the bulk of our time. But just to kind of start with a little bit of level set, I think for a really long time, measurement has been a bit elusive for those of us that are communication leaders. And I think it is primarily focused on measuring activity, right? So impressions, or maybe reach, where did we show up? How many placements did we get? And some of those measures are still important. But I think, the shift that we've seen is that, the expectation has really changed. Communication leaders are being asked to really prove their impact, the influence, and their contribution to the overall goals of the organization. And I think measurement needs to come along with to be able to show how we do that, because we all know that we do. And so it's really making sure we're able to show that direct correlation whenever possible. I will say, unfortunately, there's not a single playbook for us all to follow. It's not quite that easy. Every organization is navigating their own unique pressures, their own unique priorities. However, there are some best practices, some guidelines, some key questions, and we're going to talk about those today. And those can help us all, I think, do a better job of measuring communication in a way that really demonstrates our true value. So again, as I said, we're going to start with just a quick level set. We've got a couple of slides here, and then we're going to dive into your questions. But starting with just a, kind of what does the landscape look like today? What's the environment that we are all operating in? So talking a little bit about this era of communication measurement. So I will say we have more dashboards, more analytic platforms, more software programs, AI generated insights than we have ever had before. And on one hand, that's really exciting. And on the other hand, that is super overwhelming. So we've got this kind of data deluge happening, right? So, and I think the challenge is that more data doesn't always mean more clarity. Sometimes it actually kind of muddies the water a little bit. And so I think the real skill that as communicators that we have to think about today is how do we filter that kind of what's noise and what is high impact data, and how do we draw those insights out so that we can identify what really matters. So that's kind of what we mean by data deluge. I think the other thing we think about is executive pressure for ROI. Certainly leadership teams are under more scrutiny than ever before. We really need to be able to show that return on investment. And I think that that pressure is absolutely passed on to communication leaders as well. The good news is communication is no longer viewed as a support function. It really is understood to be a strategic partner. That is a really good thing. It is where we belong to be. And as such, it's also expected to be able to demonstrate that ROI as well. So really looking at how we can do that. Accelerated timelines, just in general, the pace of business has accelerated by a lot for a lot of reasons. And I think sometimes that turns into expectations for real-time data, real-time answers. We want to know right away if something is working. And so I think thinking about measurement, not only from, I think in the past, it's maybe looked at as kind of this retrospective reporting. And we really need to think about measurement as kind of a forward-looking decision maker instead. And so thinking about that timeline as part of that. Last one I'll mention is heightened expectations. So, internally, employees are expecting a new level, I think, of transparency and responsiveness. Externally, you've got stakeholders looking for authenticity, accountability. Measurement has to capture things like trust, sentiment, behavior. It's no longer just about the reach. And so how do we make sure we're meeting those heightened expectations? We've got some questions here on the right side, and I won't go through those. However, if you've got some thoughts about these questions, which I think are some key questions, feel free to put those in the chat, because I think that could be a great discussion point for us as well. So what pressures are you feeling from leadership? Who in your organization cares the most about communication metrics? And where are you confident and where are you unsure when it comes to communication measurement? All right, so all of this kind of level setting of the landscape, what does this mean for communication leaders? I think, it's important. I was looking at a couple of studies as we were getting ready for this webinar today, and I saw a Reagan study that showed that 79% of organizations measure internal or external communication in some way, but only 3% say their practices are mature, which they're defining by measurement occurring frequently, connected to organizational growth and supported by the for technology and positions. And only 30% of those are connecting communication data to business outcomes. So that gap is holding communication leaders back from influence and further investment in their teams. When we have those strong measures in place, we're really able to demonstrate that value and get that executive buy-in and really shape that business strategy. So just quickly, aligning metrics to business outcomes, first and foremost, really, really important that we're looking for ways to make sure that our metrics are connecting to what the organization is trying to achieve. Often that is something like growth, transformation, reputation, resilience. It could be a lot of different things, but it's really important to show that alignment. Have to start with those business priorities. Measuring behavior versus awareness. We talked about that a little bit already. Awareness used to be a measure that we'd all look at, and again, might still be applicable in some cases, but at the end of the day, it's not really a success indicator. And so how do we think about the change in behavior we're looking for? Are we asking people to act differently, take an action? Are we asking them to consider us for a purchase that they might be making? So really thinking about what that looks like from a behavior standpoint. Defining success up front. One of the biggest pitfalls, I think, in measurement is trying to retrofit metrics after the work is done. So really starting up front with defining what that success looks like and having good alignment with your leadership team so that everyone's on the same page prior to the work beginning. That's also going to really help shape what the metrics are, and everyone will be on the same page so that when we're measuring it, it makes sense. And adjusting in real time. So I saw this somewhere, I can't remember exactly where, so I can't credit it, but I saw somewhere that measurement should function like a GPS, not a rearview mirror. I thought that was kind of a nice analogy to think about. If it's not working, we need to pivot. If we're going the wrong way, we need to turn around and think about something different. Or if we found the best route in the whole world and we're going, super fast to getting to our destination even faster than we thought, maybe there's an opportunity to amp it up a little more, to spend more resources and focus there. So that ability to adjust in real time gets to some of that timing pressure that we talked about. So a couple of key questions to really think about, and I think kind of led by, when you think about your communication measurement, are you measuring volume or are you measuring value? So thinking about things like, how often does your C-suite see your metrics? So that was a question I know that we had submitted. So we'll talk about that one a little bit more deeply in a little bit here. But if leadership is only seeing communication data during an annual review or a crisis or kind of a situational aspect, that's not going to be enough. It's really not going to be seen as a strategic tool. That visibility of the data and the progress that's being made is going to help drive credibility for the function itself and communication strategy. A really, really challenging question that we like to ask is, if you had to cut 20% from your budget, what data would you use to defend that budget or to defend that decision? And again, really looking at what are the metrics that really matter when you're thinking about how executives are thinking about the business and the role that communication plays. And how does leadership define success? Not how does communication define it? How do leaders define it? How does the business define it? And again, that looking for that direct correlation between the two. So when we're doing measurement well, we have an opportunity to completely reposition how communication is showing up. So on the left-hand side here, you're seeing, we can be tactical and reactive and, a cost center, and boy, we are definitely busy. There's no doubt about that. But at the end of the day, what we really want to be seen as, what we really are, and what we want credit for is being strategic partners, being really driven by insights that drive the business, a true partner to the business and its goals, and a huge growth driver. Communication has the ability to do all of these things. And I think being able to have the data that really backs that up is really powerful.
Great. When we think about measurement and when we partner with organizations to help define the communication metrics for their organization, we really look at these three phases. So the first is output. We want to understand what are the enterprise level priorities that the communication should be supporting. So when you look at your strategic plan, when you look at the priorities of your chief human resources officer, your chief strategy officer, what are they being measured on, and how can the work of communication support the work that they are leading and that they are being measured against? The second is impact. How does communication impact that awareness, understanding, or behavior? So how does it help your audiences take action? This can be both internal and external for organizations, of course. It can be things like engagement scores, leader communication scores, retention. Externally, it can look like brand trust, behavior adoption, download rates, appointments being made, sales being generated. And then optimize. What did we learn and what should we be adjusting? So Ayme mentioned this a bit. We need to be comfortable stopping what isn't working and doubling down on what is, especially in this environment where change is a constant and the rate of change is only increasing in organizations. We also need to be willing and be able to be agile with those changes that are happening, whether that means a change in priority and being able to make that shift fairly easily, or if it's looking at the data and making changes and divesting in certain areas and investing in certain areas based on what we're seeing. So here's where we start helping you ask the right questions for your team and for your leaders within your organizations. Asking yourself, what are the business goals does this communication support? Is it something that makes a direct line to those engagement scores internally or to sales externally? What behaviors are we trying to change throughout the year, throughout the time period of your strategic plan, and how can communication help inspire those changes? What does success look like? First and foremost for the business and for your leaders, and then even for your team to look at how can every person on the communication team really understand what success looks like for them in their individual roles and how that makes a connection to the business goals and makes an impact for the business in a positive way. And then what will we do differently based on results? Making sure that you're consistently inspiring that conversation among your teams so that people are getting more and more comfortable with that ability to change, pivot, adjust on the fly. And all of that said, we know that measurement builds credibility for the work that we are all doing on a daily basis. And that credibility is what builds trust, both on behalf of the organizations that you represent, but then also for each of us individually as communication leaders. When you are able to demonstrate that your work is measuring up and supporting an organization's strategy, that's how you build that credibility. And then also how you build trust and be seen as a strategic partner to the C-suite. So getting a bit more granular, I wanted to show you just an example of how we look at a communication dashboard for an organization. We really try to make sure that we are not measuring all the things that we are all doing on a regular basis. To Amy's point on data deluge, we know there's probably at any given moment, you could log into different platforms and see 100 different metrics for the work that you're doing on a regular basis. But most importantly, we know that leaders care about how communication work really supports an organization's goal. So from the top down, if we look at what is the one business objective that our work really supports. So this, you could have a couple copies of this slide. Maybe one focuses internally on something related to an HR goal around employee engagement, for example. You know, what is that business objective to drive positive employee engagement scores? That really sits at the top of a dashboard like this for a communication team. Underneath, you look at what are those targets that the organization is measuring that where communication does play an impact in that. So for example, for an engagement score, if we're trying to improve engagement in an organization, we're looking at percentage of completion rate for an engagement survey, or we're looking at a particular metric like leader communication scores within that engagement survey that would be really important. Or we might look at retention scores. What does turnover look like for an organization if they've been going through maybe increased turnover? How can we help support engagement to drive down those turnover rates? And then underneath that is really the action that we're taking to help support those targets that we're trying to reach. So that might look like increasing content on your intranet around engagement study and making sure people are seeing that an engagement study is taking place in every pocket of the organization. You could be really amping up your support of an engagement study that's taking place. So not only are we looking at the highlights of the key activities and the key strategies that you all deployed in a quarter, we look at this on a quarter to quarter basis, but then importantly on the bottom there, you'll see action items. What are we doing about what we are learning? So if we're seeing, exponential growth in one of these ROI targets, how are we capitalizing on that in the quarter ahead and really taking what we've learned and boosting that for the next quarter? So this is what we call the so what of a dashboard. We don't want to measure just to measure. We want to measure to really influence the work that we're all doing. And I mentioned quarterly. This was one question that came in as well that we can talk further about too, is how often are we measuring? And when we think about measuring, we know that we're measuring lots of things in real time, and that's important for the communication team to be consistently taking a look at. But when we're thinking about measuring for the C-suite or for the leaders that your department or your team ladders up to, we really want to look at that on a quarterly basis so that we have enough time to really influence the results that you're seeing and be able to actually reflect on those results and the impact that you're making to then inform the next quarter's worth of work. So we like to set that expectation up front, especially with C-suite leaders, to say, you can expect to see a quarterly dashboard from us at the end of each quarter for our fiscal year, and preemptively setting up those meetings so that you put on the calendar in January your quarterly dashboard review with that C-suite leader, so that you're able to share back the impact of communication on business results, demonstrate your value, and have a good conversation with those leaders at least on a quarterly basis, so they really see how that comes to life. Great, and with that, I started to tee that up a bit, but we're going to go through each of the questions that were submitted ahead of time before today's AMA, but also feel free to drop additional questions in the meeting chat. We'll keep an eye on that as well as we go through these questions. Yep. So I'll kick it over to you, Amy, for the first one.
All right, great. This is my favorite part of the AMA. All right, first question. So vetting available internal communication channels. This particular person that submitted the question says we have 9. Is that unreasonable? Well, the answer is it depends. And it depends primarily on the size of your organization. I think as well as looking at the different types of employees that your organization has within it. So one thing that we like to do with clients is to develop employee personas to really understand how do we kind of categorize the different types of employees that are within the organization. That will often help us determine how many metrics make sense. Not that you necessarily have a metric for every persona, although you might. But that will help to kind of segment in a way that will help you figure out what the right metrics are. And so, if you have 10 different employee personas who are working very differently in the organization, 9 metrics might very well be needed. I would say more often than not, you're probably going to want to look for ways to scale that back a little bit and really be able to tighten that. And I think, at the end of the day, it's less about how many metrics you have, and it's more about, do those metrics ladder up to a business goal? Are they demonstrating a behavior change or a shift that is going to help support an internal or an external goal? In this case, maybe it's retention or engagement, but making sure that there's that direct connection. That alone might help you kind of narrow in on what the highest value metrics are going to be for your internal team.
I'll also add on to that one when we're thinking about channels that you have for your organization, really putting it on a whiteboard and demonstrating how many are push channels, how many, for example, an email newsletter. You're pushing an email newsletter out to your employee base, probably a pretty standard practice for most organizations. But then to balance that, where are people going to seek out information to kind of pull content from the organization, find it themselves? For example, an intranet serves as that pull channel. So really making sure you have the right balance of push versus pull based channels is a really important exercise. We actually just completed an internal communication audit for a large organization of about 40,000 employees. And when we put up all the different communication channels that exist in their ecosystem, of which there were many more than 9 actually, when we were able to put them up on the wall, we realized that about 90% of them were push channels, so that the organization was pushing information out to their employee base, which sometimes is very important, but we really needed to rebalance that channel ecosystem to make sure that there was a better balance there kind of overall for the organization.
And then doing an internal communication audit can be a really great way to identify what's the right mix based on who your employees are and how they need to and want to receive information. So that's a really nice way to figure out what the right channels and metrics are as well.
The next question here, how do you perform social listening to help set strategy and measure outcomes? I would say listening is always an important activity to be doing both inside and outside organizations. So making sure in social media, it's important to understand the conversations happening where a brand can authentically participate and jump in. So what are the, let's say, 4 topics that you have decided are really the topics where you can be proactive and have a proactive voice? You want to be watching that on a regular basis to then be able to jump in and kind of act on the fly when and where it makes sense. And then internally, doing listening through surely annual engagement studies, but then even looking at more day-to-day activities to be listening along the way. So is there a feedback loop? Is there an anonymous feedback channel where people can be submitting their questions and comments on a regular basis so that we can be reacting in real time and understanding what really matters for employees? Sometimes an intranet plays a good function for that too. So you can be reading dialogue on a particular internal news story and you have an open chat function where you see how people are engaging or what types of content is really performing really well. If people like, a particular type of story, that type of listening to your content as well is also important.
Great. I'll jump to the next question. Just a reminder, if you have a question that you're not seeing represented here on the slide, please either, if you want to raise your hand and share it just verbally, that's great. Otherwise, if you want to put it in the chat, that works as well. Want to make sure that we're getting to everyone's questions here with our time together. So another question we received, how do I tie individual performance goals to overall unit and enterprise metrics in a way that is meaningful and objectively measurable? That's a tough question when you're looking at kind of the business goal all the way down to individual performance. So I'm going to give you a couple of examples from a communication measurement standpoint, and then we can talk about some other things as well. But I think that the key that we've talked about a little bit here is to create that clear line of sight from daily activities to communication outcomes to business impact. And so starting with the business in mind, starting with the end in mind, so those enterprise priorities, and really asking yourself the question of, where does communication measurably influence the outcomes? So that's getting to your communication KPIs and metrics. That will really help you figure out from a team standpoint what the communication team is measuring. From there, you can come up with what your individual metrics are. So for individual team members, what does that start to look like? So one example might be if the enterprise goal is to reduce voluntary turnover by 10%. We know the behavioral driver might be that employees feel informed and valued, making this up, but a communication outcome as part of that might be increased understanding of what the growth opportunities are. And an individual metric there might be maybe it's like a career path campaign or manager toolkits or town halls, things that directly tie into that understanding of growth opportunities. So you can see how it all starts to kind of ladder together, but it's making sure you're showing that connection to all of them. So importantly, having those communication team metrics is going to make it a lot easier for individual metrics to come out of that. So one other example that you can think about is if your enterprise goal is employee engagement or retention, you might find that one of your communication metrics as a team is to really look at manager communication effectiveness scores. So if we know like that manager communication is really important for that retention. And then an individual's work might be manager communication toolkits, how well they're internalized, how well they're utilized, how often they're used in work. So you can see again kind of how that all sort of ties together, but it really does depend on your enterprise goals and your team metrics that you're looking at there. Abigail, anything you'd add to that?
No, I think that's great. I'll hop to the next one. What have you found to be the most effective cadence for presenting measurement? So I touched on this a bit, but I'll reiterate. We really think quarterly is the best way to develop a dashboard and a measurement report out to executive leaders that you report up into, typically into the C-suite. It's really easy to get buried in the day-to-day metrics and measures that are available in real time, and it's still important to monitor those. But when it comes to reporting out, we think quarterly can demonstrate that meaningful movement. Ideally, setting up quarterly touch bases or QBRs with the appropriate leaders, make sure that that sets that expectation early so that you aren't caught off guard when a leader asks you, hey, was that effective, or how are we doing on XYZ? Being able to show them that we will talk about that quarterly and we're watching it in real time and we'll keep you updated helps to kind of lessen that pressure when you set that expectation up front. I would say we recently worked with an organization too to share a little bit of detail around this. We worked with an organization to take what had been a 50-slide PowerPoint that measured everything a communication team did on a quarterly basis. It was sincerely 50 slides, which was full of robust, great information, but it was simply too much to be giving to a C-suite. And so we were able to cull that down and bring it down to, I think it was 4 or 5 slides in the end that demonstrated how communication supported each pillar of their strategic plan on a quarterly basis. Presented that to the chief strategy officer, and he literally said, I can absolutely see exactly how communication supports the strategic plan, which was, of course, the end goal. And I'll say fast forward a handful of months, there was a reduction in force at this organization, at a client organization of ours, and the communication team was not impacted by that reduction in force. Of course, I'm not going to say the dashboard was the result, was the reason why there was no impact in reduction of force, but it was just an interesting insight to take a look at that we know the C-suite definitely saw the value of communication in that organization.
That's a really great example, Abigail. So next question is on what is the best approach for AI measurement? Really good question. I'm really happy somebody asked this question because it's becoming more and more important as we take a look at how we're showing up, certainly online in the digital space. I think it's interesting when you take a look at how quickly AI is becoming essentially a decision layer or an influencer in how people certainly reach our website, if they reach it at all, because we're starting to see that sometimes people look at the AI results and don't click through to a website. It has a big influence on how you're showing up from a brand standpoint, from a tone standpoint. I think it's becoming just incredibly influential. So some of the things that we're thinking about when it comes to AI measurement is to look at things like visibility. So are you showing up in the right ways and with the right prompts? So for instance, if your organization aspires to be the best in its particular industry, making sure you're looking at those prompts to make sure that you are rising to the top of that conversation, that you are in that conversation when those AI results surface. Looking at how, kind of you're showing up versus your competitors is important in that visibility space. So is it feel like the kind of the right level of you versus your competitors? Are you showing up and positioned the way that you want to be positioned, making sure that you're in that conversation? So it's more than just, frequency. It's really how are you showing up? And so I think part of that is testing prompt results. So you can do that on your own. Certainly there are AI visibility tracking tools that do that more so every day. There are some different ways to do that. I think the other piece of that is that accuracy and positioning. So is AI describing your brand correctly? Are you getting the right information out to folks about kind of who you are and what you stand for and what you do and what differentiates you? So is it factually accurate? Is the tone and sentiment right? Is there misinformation out there about your brand? So that is a really important thing to look at. And that is something that can be very much influenced by things like owned content, earned media, and certainly really starting to explore more around generative engine optimization. That's becoming a really big territory to take a look at. And within that, there are more kind of AI measures and platforms that are becoming available. Again, kind of more every day. But I think those are some of the initial things to be looking at because it is very much becoming an influencer and how people certainly see your brand and interact with your brand.
When you're thinking about the operations of a communication team as well, there's different metrics to look at for AI as well. So we don't want to necessarily be looking at measuring the tool itself, but we want to look at the impact that a tool has on your team and on the output of the work that you have. So you could look at things like operational efficiency. Does it reduce the time to a first draft of a newsletter, for example? Does it free up senior level talent for higher value work? You can measure some of that time saved or cost per deliverable, making sure that you can measure the volume of output, for example, without increased headcount. Those are some kind of internal metrics. You could also look at, if you're in charge of developing blog content for your website, or internally or externally, you could look at quality and brand alignment scores. So efficiency through AI really doesn't mean anything if the quality starts to slip. So making sure, does the AI content you're generating meet brand standards? Does it align with voice and messaging? So making sure that you're really taking a close eye at that and then optimizing your AI tool appropriately. Really understanding, okay, how do we need to train our model to meet brand voice a little bit more consistently? You could also test kind of different blog posts that were written solely by a human or written by AI as a first draft. That's another interesting thing to take a look at is testing two different approaches and seeing what performs better. I would generally avoid vanity metrics like number of prompts written or number of AI generated assets. Kind of generally, usage doesn't equate to impact typically. All right, and then the last question here that has been submitted so far is, I'm interested in understanding how other companies tie their communication efforts to sales outcomes when there's not a direct tie that can be made. And typically we would say there isn't often a real direct correlation there, but we want to make sure we can thread that line from the work of communication team through to a sales team and business results through the lens of sales. So for example, if an organization and a sales team goal is to increase sales of product A, you can really be looking at communication priorities that support that particular goal. So for example, are you developing more content or just really solid, fresh content in support of product A that the sales team is trying to sell? And when you put that content out there, what is the engagement rate of that content? You could look at social media metrics that specific to the content that supports that goal of the sales team. You could look at number of a percentage increase of content or communication support for that particular product or service that you're trying to sell. Those are all kind of metrics that help line up to the sales team goals. Another opportunity there to integrate marketing communication teams with the sales team is really coming together to have some good discussions around sales enablement. How can we make sure that the sales team is really confident in their own leadership communication and how they're being a leader in the industry when they're out selling a particular product? So we can make sure that those two sides of the house between marketing and sales are working really closely together with a shared set of messaging. We need to make sure that that value prop language is consistent between what marketing's putting out in the marketplace with advertising, paid social content that you're generating. You want to make sure that that is in close concert to what the sales team is actually saying when they're in sales focused meetings. So that sounds really basic, but we do actually see more of a disconnect there in a lot of especially large organizations where the marketing team is not sitting next to the sales team, and thus their worlds are not intersecting as often as they could or should.
I do want to give a minute. I know there are a couple of folks on the call who actually submitted the questions. So I just want to give an opportunity if there's anything either we didn't answer or if you've got a follow-up, to please let us know that. And we want to make sure that we're answering the right questions and as you intended. So if there is any follow-up, please let us know. Also, if there are any other questions in general, let us know. I think so please keep submitting questions, but we've got about 5 to 8 minutes left here. So just a couple other things that I think are interesting and worth noting. So as we were preparing for this webinar, Abigail and I were talking through just a lot of different aspects of measurement. And I think one thing that comes up that we hear from clients is, where should organizations start if they don't have a measurement program in place? Where do we even start? It can feel overwhelming. It can feel really uncertain. And I think, we talked a little bit about really starting with the business goals, and that is certainly where we do suggest that you start, and those priorities, and really defining success together. And I think the more collaborative you can be in that effort, the better it's going to be, the more meaningful those metrics are going to be. So making sure that you're understanding, again, what behaviors are needed to get where you need to as an organization, and then determining how communication can impact those behaviors, and then building your metrics from there. So that really allows you to create measurements and goals that are, goals that are measurable, that are time bound. Everyone talks about SMART goals, and I think that's really important because it really makes sure that everyone is clear on what the outcome is that we're trying to create. I also think looking for opportunities for benchmarking is really, really important. So looking for the ability to check on how things are going over time. So those kind of benchmarks and success metrics can be really helpful as you look at a program or an initiative over time to see how things are progressing. Not seeing anything else submitted. Abigail, what do you think about in terms of when we talk about like the volume of options and data can be so overwhelming, right? So what's the best way to share it with executive leaders in a way that is most valuable? So there's so much. We've looked a little bit at a dashboard, but how do you talk to clients about how best to share that with executive leaders so that it's meaningful, but not overwhelming?
Sure. That is where we really look at an organization's strategic plan. So typically there's, let's say, 4 pillars, usually between 3 and 5 kind of core priorities within an organization's strategic plan. So really we try to make sure that our dashboard and our metrics are being organized in a way that is directly related to that strategic plan. So for each pillar, for example, maybe one is employee engagement, kind of generally. For that pillar, we have a one-page dashboard that shows how communication is supporting that pillar. So then if there's 5 pillars in an org strategic plan, or 5 key priorities, lots of different language there can be used, there's one page for each of those priorities that show how communication is directly supporting it. That's not to say the day-to-day work that we all do isn't important. It certainly is. And so sometimes we will also include a highlights reel of maybe it's top performing content kind of generally during that quarter, just to give a little bit of that flavor for the other work that was going on that maybe doesn't draw as close of a connection to the strategic plan, but it might still be something we're really proud of. That also relates to how we measure crisis. We do kind of track those metrics related to crisis and report back on those, even if it's not directly related to part of the strategic plan. That reputation management and reputation support is also incredibly an important role of all of us here as communicators. So we can look at things like measuring, did an issue that we managed turn into a crisis, or were we able to really manage it in that issues phase and keep it fairly contained? So we track that, and we report back on how many issues were managed in a particular organization on a quarter-to-quarter basis. That's important to be able to reflect back on, to learn from each of those experiences, and to really be able to demonstrate, hey, remember when I told you to not go out to publicly and make a statement on X? That's because we didn't want to garner more attention, and that approach was successful. So you're able to kind of say, kind of recap some of those issues and crisis scenarios that, frankly, we tend to want to move past really quickly once the issue has been resolved. So that provides another opportunity to recap some of those more crisis or issues related work products that we're all managing on a regular basis.
Great, thanks. We've got just a couple more minutes. So if anyone has a final question or something else you've been thinking about or want to share, now would be a good time for that. Quiet group. Okay. Well, I think as we start to wrap things up here, just a couple of kind of, I guess, reinforcements or reminders that I think are really important. Making sure that anchoring any measurement in what leadership cares about, that's going to help make sure that your work is high value and indispensable. That really builds the case for how important strategic communication is. Making sure that you're looking for those behaviors, what actually changed as a result of the work that you did and the communication that was put forward. Making sure that you are doing measurement in a way that's going to build credibility and inform decisions. I think that making sure that, again, you're using it as a way to help really bring the business forward is really important. And again, really puts that credibility front and center for the communication leaders and team. And making sure you're being proactive and sharing it. So I think Abigail talked about a great cadence for how often to share, but also make sure that you don't wait to be asked. Make sure that you are providing that proactively, again, showing up as a leader, that you understand the connection to the business. And I think that's a really important way too to show up as that strategic partner. Any other final thoughts from you, Abigail?
I think that's it. I think this is really such an important topic to be able to elevate communicators as strategic partners to the C-suite. And so we really partner with our client organizations to help communicators do that and step into that strategic advisor role in the organizations that they are supporting on a daily basis. So I think that measurement is a really tangible way to help get communication leaders there and get frankly, a seat at that table with the C-suite when you're planning priorities and looking at metrics for the organization. Making sure that communication has a seat at that table is something that's really important to us and our client organizations.
Absolutely. Well, I want to thank all of you for joining us today and investing some time with us on this topic. I hope it was valuable. If you have other questions that occur to you or things you just either didn't want to ask in this session or that occur to you on the back end of it, please feel free to reach out to us directly. We're happy to have that conversation. And again, really appreciate you spending part of your day with us. So thanks so much.
Thanks, everybody.